Hi, everybody. Happy Monday. We are halfway through the summer session. It's always goes really fast, but we're going to get through it. We're going to start moving into really talking about American English with this week. But first, we have to, as we move into more recent history, maybe ironically, for some of you, there's a lot more of it to talk about. And so I know that these chapters 4 and 5 get a little dense in terms of especially talking about like British political history, the royal families, and all the things like that. One thing that I wanted to pick out a little bit from chapter 4 was the Act of Succession, or I'm sorry, the Act of Settlement of 1701. And what happens here is maybe some of you are familiar with like Queen Elizabeth dies without an heir. This is how James I, James Stuart, the first of the Stuart dynasty, becomes king. This is what links the crowns of Scotland and England together, which, as you can imagine, is going to have really big repercussions for our discussion of the history of English. His grandson, James II, right, we're always going to have these religious conflicts going on in England. James II has real Catholic lenient policies, and this is actually causes a sort of mini coup that takes place where the English peerage asks, the sort of lords gather together and they ask James II's nephew, William of Holland, and of course Holland at this point is very Protestant, to take the throne. William, to help his cause, weds, I guess I should say, Mary Stuart, who is James II's daughter from his first marriage, to help his cause, and they are seated as William and Mary after the death of James II. Now, the problem is, James had a son. He did have a son, and of course, as you all know, patrilineal lines, even though English queens can inherit the throne, it will always go to a son. But his son Charles was again raised Catholic, which was seen as being this huge problem. Charles was also very much raised in Scotland, which of course was the homeland of the Stuarts. And this is Bonnie Prince Charlie, right? This is Charles, the son of James II. He will become known as the Young Pretender to the English, right? But his cause, he will become a sort of lightning rod. He'll become a sort of symbol of Scottish independence for many, many years. A key event that happens is Bonnie Prince Charlie's attempt to retake the throne at the Battle of Culloden in 1745. And I say that's a key event because that is what is actually going after 1745. The Highland Scots who supported Bonnie Prince Charlie were going to be forced, it was the Highland clearances, they were going to be forced off their land, and they were forced first into Northern Ireland and eventually to the Americas, where, and I'm going to get to this shortly, they would eventually immigrate across the Appalachians, and they are going to be the ancestors of a lot of, these are the Scots-Irish ancestors of many people, many families still living in the Appalachian region. And so this is the connection that this chapter makes, right? I did want to point out that even before then, if there's a key sort of unifying factor in these two chapters in the story of English for today, it's that English colonialism begins first and foremost in Scotland and Ireland, and it is linguistic colonialism because it starts in the schools that you have. And they emphasize this on page 141, how in the Church of Scotland schools, it was compulsory. They were forced to learn English. Like the Scots tongue, Scots Gaelic was no longer allowed to be spoken. And I did want to, this had actually happened earlier in Ireland, all the way back in 1366. With Edward declaring the Statutes of Kilkenny that forced anybody dealing with the nobility in Ireland to speak English. So it's a really good example of this sort of top-down legal encoding of language, and how school itself can be used to gonna let my cat out here. School itself can become an instrument of colonial oppression. In chapter 4, they make a very clear connection between the Scots language spoken by the Scots-Irish immigrants and Appalachian English. And I thought that the example they use of Ray Hicks telling the same stories, the Jack Tales, that Stanley Robertson, Ray Hicks is living in Appalachia and Stanley Robertson is living in Aberdeen, Scotland, and they're telling stories that even separated by a couple centuries, you can see the common ancestry that comes from them in the language itself. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Mountain Talk video that really links, it gives more specific examples of this a little bit later on. But, the key thing here is that it gives the lie to the notion that Appalachian English is in any way an ignorant way of talking. It is, if anything, much more closely connected to these older forms of British of English and also Scots. I also thought the chapter ended, and this is an important history to remember, that this is all about politics and economics, because at the end of chapter 4, they talk about the very specific reasons why it was actually some of these freeholders, people who are not slave owners who lived in Kentucky, but they owned their land up in the mountains, and they did not support the cause of slavery in Kentucky, which was a border state, and they were essentially punished for this by some of the old money of the South for their Union sympathies. And that was actually one of the first, even before the coal companies came in, that was one of the first things that kind of encouraged that the sort of economic depression of Appalachia was not sort of a historical accident. And I think it links it back in important ways. I mean, this population that had already been forced out by oppressive colonialist policies kind of encountered them again, as they came into the United States. So it is really kind of a striking, for people from the region not familiar with the history, I mean, it's a really important part of the history to know. So I definitely wanted to talk a little bit about the Mountain Talk video, and I know that it's longer, and I also know it is not set in Kentucky, that it's actually, almost all the interviews take place in and around Robbinsville, North Carolina, which is far western North Carolina, very much in the southern Appalachians. And the reason I picked it, that there are videos that talk about Kentucky, or at least on the western side of the Appalachians, dialects. And that's important because a speaker within the Mountain Talk video itself acknowledges that, it is a little bit fallacious to talk about Appalachian English as a unified thing when it changes county by county, he even says, or from like holler to holler. And so I wanted to acknowledge that. I did want to say I picked this video precisely because it is so, it was commissioned by University of North Carolina, Asheville, and it is so kind of like intent on not talking about these people from the region, but actually letting them just speak in their own voice. And it's one of the things that I really appreciate about the video. And as y'all watch it, maybe talk about some similarities and differences that you see sort of hearing that North Carolina Appalachian English versus what you maybe, if you grew up in the region, something that you've encountered. A lot of it might have surprised you, given what we talked about just last week, or 2 weeks ago, but it might have surprised you how much people talked about Chaucer in this video. And, this shows an awareness that they have of just how old the language is. And I did want to just point out two usages that pop up in the video that really are very old. I mean, really date back to Old English. And the first is scald, as talking about a sort of waste area or like a barrens. That is Old English for sure. And we still have it in the verb scald, right? Which is something that's burned away. But to use it as describing an area of land is actually a much older use of that word. And then wonderfully, and I've heard this before firsthand, the pronoun hit, putting that H in front of the third person neuter pronoun it with an H in front of it. That is not people adding in the H sound. That is them retaining the H sound. And I have to point out that this is one of the innovations, I guess, that Norse introduced, that we lost hit because of the influence of Old Norse. I mean, that's how old that pronoun usage is. So it's really kind of striking that people still use it in areas of Appalachia. And I did also want to point out there's some paradoxical things that get said in the video. I mean, at some point, some speakers say that growing up in Appalachia was absolutely, they would never leave, like it was sort of heaven on earth, were some of the quotes that they have. And then other speakers saying I would just as soon be in hell with my back broke rather than return, right? And they talk about how hard it was growing up there. And I think that absolutely speaks to, again, all of the sort of economic oppression that we talked about, that people sort of like innately find the best in what's around them. But I mean, it also speaks to the sort of generational poverty that was really put in place. And again, like very consciously, first by the forced immigration itself, and then by Southern landowners who had been sympathetic to the Confederate cause. And then, of course, after that, really, energy companies, outside energy companies coming in and really taking advantage of the land for its natural resources. And before this video gets too long, I'm going to sort of talk about the Rob Words and the 5 Hardest British Accents videos together. In Rob Words, I just want to point out again how he talks about mutual intelligibility between the Goidelic and Brythonic Celtic languages. Just proves the existence of language families. The fact that you have Breton and Cornish speakers and Scots Gaelic and Irish speakers who can sort of understand each other because their languages are that close. It gets really complex. You can appreciate one of the reasons, he doesn't talk about this in the video, but one of the reasons that Celtic languages do not influence English as much as, say, Latin or Danish, or, Old Norse, is again language families. Because Welsh, for example, this whole business of soft mutation triggers and the sound of the opening consonant of the word can change based on what noun case it is. I mean, this is something that comes naturally to native Welsh speakers because they grow up doing it. But for us, it has to be this very sort of laborious, and they joke about it in the video, this very laborious process of thinking, okay, I have to put the W sound instead of the G sound in front of this one, for example. And then, just the 5 hardest British accents, just to run through them, are Brummie, which is the Black Country or Birmingham dialect; Geordie, which is spoken up in the north around Newcastle; Scouse, which is spoken in Liverpool; Glaswegian from Glasgow; and Cockney. And really quick, Geordie, Scouse, and Glaswegian all are going to influence Appalachian English because they're very sort of close up in the north, right, to where some of these Scots are going to be emigrating from. And you can even kind of like hear that maybe in some of the usages. Cockney is interesting because I don't think Cockney is that hard to understand. It has a reputation in England as being hard to understand. I think that's all about class because Cockney employs a lot of slang terms. It is meant to be kind of exclusive because they're trying to make the rich folk have a hard time understanding them. And so it's if you pay attention to that video, when she talks about Cockney, there isn't a lot in terms of deep phonetics and tactical structure that's different. It's all about like vocabulary and sort of rhetorical stance. And I want you to remember that when we get to African American vernacular English for next week, because I think that there's a lot of interesting parallels between Cockney and African American vernacular English in how they sort of very self-consciously attempt to define a class of people within the language.